All right, well, while Balint's setting up, just go ahead and do a quick introduction to Balint Seeber. Balint's been great fun to work with, and you'll see all the cool, fun stuff he does. He goes around really evangelizing software radio to all crowds all over the world. Instrumental in the ISE E3 satellite work that happened last summer. Just some really, really fun, amazing stuff. And so that is, so like I said, you'll see why we call this the Balint Show.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Bob. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to show you some cool things in software-defined radio just before I sort of begin my talk formally. At these sorts of events, I think it's always become a custom for at least some of us to pop open our software-defined radios and, while somebody's talking on one of these wireless microphones, find a frequency and then try to perhaps rickroll. That's kind of a little bit of a tradition. But as I was looking at it this morning, when the microphone was being passed around while people were asking the Godfather some questions, I noticed that, in fact, in this instance, it's not actually narrowband FM with a pilot. You see that signal there in the very middle? Open up a little more. It looks like some sort of digital modulation scheme. So in this case, they're using fancy microphones, which is a first, at least as far as I've seen. So my challenge for all you folk out there is if you want to grab your software-defined radios, I can even leave this microphone on, or I think there's another transition just down to the left. Have a look. If there's time, I'd like to go through some flow graphs with you to give you some tips on how you might begin to reverse engineer the signal. It might be some sort of phase shifting, it might be some sort of OFDM. But you can use GNU radio. Was there a... Yeah, and you can figure out what this is. So the challenge then is, if you want over the next couple of days, use GNU radio to try and reverse engineer this. It's probably some sort of digital modulation with some sort of vocoder on top of it, and it's probably proprietary, so it might be difficult to recover the audio, but at least it's still worth it applying some techniques. So I'll leave that here in case. That was 503.3 megahertz if you wanted to try it. All right. So that's all working. And then just to continue on that, I guess, before I begin, is that legible? Honestly, yeah. So just to give a sort of pre-intro then with GNU radio, this would be a simple flow graph that you might consider using if you ever go to a venue where they do have an analog wireless system. I've been pretty fortunate with this flow graph. These sorts of analog wireless mics use narrowband FM, and they put a pilot tone in there. So essentially, you have the audio coming from the microphone, plus, in this case, and exactly, what is it, F is 32,768. So it's a nice power of 2. You insert that pilot in there in the right sort of levels, frequency modulate that, transmit that out, and then you can, if you have a nice powerful transmitter, you can rickroll anyone that's actually using their mic. So if this was an analog system, you'd hear Rick Astley coming around at the moment. But anyway, that's a little bit of a trick. It can be very simple. So I'm just going to switch, hopefully this will bring it out. And if we've got time, then we'll come back to some more flow graphs. Okay. So while this appears, then I'll just do the speaking. Here we go. Good. I really ought to consolidate to one laptop like a normal person. Slideshow. From beginning. Alright, there we go. So you might recognize this slide. My name is Balint Seeber. I'm the Director of Vulnerability Research at Bastille Networks. At Bastille Networks, we're securing the Internet of Things for the enterprise. We're looking at security in the wireless spectrum. But as you can see, well, not quite in this contrast, but I'm wearing my Edis Research hoodie in the background while Sutra Tower looms in the background. So it's always a good place to snatch up some wireless spectrum to reverse engineer that. So today I'd like to show you a couple of things that I was working on in the recent past at Edis Research, and a couple of fun things that you can look at in your own time if you're interested. They are, no, it's all right, it's all balanced, it's fine. So drones, first-person video, vehicular entry. Colleague there has a Toyota Prius, and that was always very interesting how that system worked. And visualization and multipart. Multipart is always an interesting problem for wireless communication receivers and transmitters in the real world. Commonly that's dealt with by using OFDM, but there are still some other solutions out there that require equalization to mitigate multipart. But I thought it would be interesting to actually look and see what that actually could be visualized as. So largely this all uses GNU radio. And in the background here, if you haven't used Boardline is a piece of software written by Eric Wilson. It's absolutely fantastic for offline analysis of signals. It runs on OS X and on Linux, and it's really brilliant. You just want to sort of zoom in. So these background shots are actually visualizations of the frequency domain of the various signals in question. So here we're looking at the uplink channel from remote controls in the ISM band to actually control drones as they fly around. And as you can see, it's frequency hopping. So they have meetups all over, and there's a meetup in Berkeley. I went out there once, and it was really cool to watch people actually race their drones. And if you actually have a look at this little video from Make Magazine, this is what drone racing looks like. Tiny little drones, people wearing first-person vision goggles, and is this actually working?
Interfering with another pilot's frequencies means complete loss of control of the craft.
So it's pretty incredible to watch because they all have the FPV. Let's just try that one more time. They all have the FPV goggles on, so they're seeing the world from the point of view of the drone. And if you think it's all happening wirelessly, right, because it's not tethered. And I was curious as to what sort of scheme they were using to actually send the video back. And I'll come back to that in a minute because it's on the other laptop and we won't go through that very long. But we got a 3D Robotics X8 Plus drone, which is a pretty nice big kit with 8 props on it and a push-pull configuration. And it can lift a significant payload. And the first flight, for those of you that know what I mean.
That's what I'm talking about.
It was nice. When the navigation system on board worked and everything, it's actually really, really easy to fly one of these things when you've got GPS lock and measurement systems all active. And so it's once you get over that initial fear of crashing and burning the thing, it's good.
So are you the reason the FAA is releasing the 350-foot rule today?
I'll address that. So one nice thing about these systems is that apart from the radio uplink from the remote control and the video downlink, if you choose to install that module on your drone, is that you also have a radio modem that operates in 915, also frequency hopping, that transmits telemetry back to your laptop. And so here you can run a piece of software and it will actually tell you the stats about the drone and show you where it is on the map. As you can see there, this is actually the park just across the way from Edis Research HQ. So, as I said, it can lift significant payloads, NS Research has this nifty new little compact embedded SDR, perfect for as a payload on the bottom of one of these things. And to boot, you can get these tiny little USB Wi-Fi dongles that you can plug in there. And Phil Ballister has been very busy creating nice images for this. And he added host AP configuration, so you can actually turn one of these into a flying Wi-Fi access point. So you can have it up in the air, get your laptop out, connect to this network flying in the sky, and then control whatever on there. And you've probably also seen the demos where Tom Zhu was pretty important in getting this working, put open BTS on one of these things, so you can turn all these compact things into a cell phone base station, maybe. I'm not suggesting you do, but you know, things like IMSI sniffing, or setting up a legitimate temporary.
You can run GSM in the ham bands.
Without encryption.
Yes.
But you can also, if you need the height, and this is where it's cool to have such a computer and SDR platform on a mobile airborne platform, is that you can actually give it significant height. If you think about it, one thing that's often really hard to find is roof space to set up antennas. Sure, you're restricted by battery power here, but if you need to get significant altitude, you can just strap one of these things on there, take it up to whatever the current ceiling is, 350, and then do your airborne collection, so that's really nice. But coming back to the video, one interesting point was that I noticed when the competitors actually got out there to participate, they needed to talk with the central controller to figure out spectrum management. So actually assigning the various frequencies for the video feed so that they wouldn't compete with one another. And then if you could put an E310 on there, I thought it would be interesting to actually put a webcam on there, hook that up into the E310 because it has USB, and then send the vision back digitally. And that could afford you other advantages like being able to frequency hop, by being able to use a much narrower bandwidth, because you'll see that, as it turns out, the analog bandwidth occupied by the video is pretty significant. But I'll show you what that is because I'd like you to try and guess based off the spectrum. So webcams hooked up to the E310. The idea is that you have the transmitter in the E310 that's transmitting your data through some modulation scheme using video radio, and then on the receiver it's demodulating it and showing you the frame. You can use video for Linux, that's the instruction layer that allows you to grab the frames with the webcam, and then you take these packets, you can treat them as any sort of arbitrary payload. In this case they just happen to be video frames. You can fragment them, packetize them, add your own custom header on there, and then pass them into the existing digital packet utilities within video radio to prepare them for sending them over the air. That's just some of the details there. Not particularly interesting, that when you do end up doing these sort of streaming fragmented protocols, you need to keep track of sequence numbers and offsets into your entire packet, so that at the receiver you can reconstruct a complete packet and then verify that you've received the data intact, which is where a checksum often comes in handy. So this is the initial prototype. Here you've got the webcam, and on the E310 it's actually running a GNU radio flow graph, and it's sending each frame using the GMSK modulator in a bursty fashion over to the other laptop that is receiving the video, and as you can see it's displaying it there. And these are transmitting the hardware compressed motion JPEG frames from the webcam. And the flow graph here is actually pretty simple. I guess one interesting thing to note is that which version? This is the PSK version. So you saw GMSK before. GMSK obviously you only get with QBSK you get double the number of bits per symbol compared to GMSK. And so in this case, I wanted to keep the carrier alive even though there might not have been a frame to send. And so there's a little bit of trickery here, where if there's a UDP packet available on the port, it takes that and modulates that, and if there's no UDP packet, then it just sends out a pseudo noise sequence to the modulator. The modulator is on the right-hand side. It's actually the decomposed version of what's in the PSK modulator block. So GNU Radio has some really nice hierarchical blocks that actually contain all these details and guts underneath. You can just drop that in. If you want to break it apart and sort of experiment with the innards, you can look at the source code in Python and then reconstruct that, so that's really nice. And then on the receive side, actually I just use the cam demodulator in this first instance. And then you go to the D-framer. A little bit of that is using some blocks from GRMac. John Malsbury put together this really nice little project called GRMac some years ago. I recommend you check it out. It was the idea of trying to extract the PHY and the MAC and the upper layers into a graphical representation in GNU radio. It's really nice. But that would then go out to some Python, and then it would grab the frames, reconstruct the packets. Here, this is the very first test, and I've got to thank Neil Pandy over there. Hi, Neil. And he was kind enough to come out and help me film this. So right now there is the E210 on that drone with the webcam. It's going through a bit of a test flight there. And when we look at the laptop, you can see that APM player. You're already running the bottom left, doing demodulation is the waterfall, and on the top right is the video, but it's a little bit dark, unfortunately. Maybe you can see it. So now I've rotated the drone back around, pointing back at us.
Is that the drone?
So the cool thing about this is that you now have a video airborne platform sending QPSK down, received by your radio, being fragged, defragged, and parsed, and checked, and displayed. And if you choose to develop this further, then you can turn this into any sort of scheme you like. I mean, ideally you'd be OFDM, and you can probably leverage RF NOC to do this in the E210, so there's some really exciting stuff there to up the bandwidth. And then you can also see some interesting stuff. So here at an altitude of 25 meters, of course you can go even higher. It's kind of scary because if you're in a residential area, then you can see into a real backyard into their house. So no wonder people are trying to shoot these drones out of the sky. So, you know, and naturally the next part of this is, well, if this is all RF controlled, then if people want to get nasty on the radio bands, then you can go and try and jam these things on this ISM, right? It's fair game, or is it? These drones often have a lot of safety features built into them, safety mechanisms, fail-safe. So for example, if they lose link with the remote control, even though you might not be inputting anything, it still maintains the keep alive, and if it doesn't hear the remote anymore, then it will actually go and try and land itself back at the launch point. Or if it runs out of battery, then it will actually fly back and automatically try to land itself. Really clever stuff. And then that's actually the view. I had a GoPro strapped to the back, so that's the HD view. But in more recent tests we did, there was the C920 webcam that does H.264. So actually that would have been the view from the drone in full HD. So it's a big system. A little bit of an aside to finish this off. We were running a Cyber Spectrum meetup in the South Bay at SHQ, and we were all leaving, and this is my good friend Austin Epps, who was the lead engineer on the ISE-3 reboot mission. We were walking outside, we heard this beeping, couldn't figure out where it was coming from. And we were looking around, and this beeping was increasing in frequency and tone. And we looked up into the sky, and suddenly we saw this alternating green and red light, and it was flying in one particular direction in a straight line pretty quickly, and it kept blinking and flashing and making noises faster and faster and faster, more frequently. And we just tracked it and thought, oh, here we go, someone's being smart and doing something crazy with their drone. And we just kept following it, and next thing we knew, the lights extinguished, sound disappeared, and we just saw this thing fall out of the sky. And we thought, all right, let's get in the car and try and find it. We drove around, eventually we found it a little bit further down. And we thought, well, usually these drones have some sort of black box, so they have GPS in them and they will record the position. And if we can open it and download that information, then we can take it back to the owners and say, hey, you lost the drone. You better keep an eye next time. And after doing some research, these drones, an older version of the firmware actually has a flyaway bug. So you can put the firmware into a state where it doesn't respond to commands anymore, and it will just fly away because you've got it locked into some loop. And unfortunately in this case, we took it apart only to find that there was no persistent storage on the thing, so we couldn't figure out where it would come from. So very sorry to the people that had launched it, but judging from the speed that it had been flying, and if it was flying in that direction, it had been flying a long time, so it was very far from home. The problem was this. Who can see what the problem is here? Any guesses? Remember I was talking about fail-safe? I'll give you a clue, lower left.
Joystick 200%.
Landing voltage. The landing voltage was set to 0.1 volts, which is a very, very low voltage. Your autopilot probably won't even run at that point. So it was crazy that you could actually change that to that low. I guess they wanted to try to get the maximum flight time out of their drone, but of course the drone is going to shut down long before that happens. So please set your landing voltage to something reasonable. Because, no, I'm serious, because the more crazy people out there doing weird things like this with their drone, it'll catch the attention of certain authorities and they'll clamp down on this. And if you're responsible and do it nicely, then this is actually a pretty fun thing to do. So that's the first thing. The next thing was vehicular entry or proximity entry into vehicles. Just to forewarn you, in this instance, it's not a success story, it's actually just a sort of exploration using GNU radio of a wireless security system, but also a good lesson in well-designed security. So you've probably seen Toyota Prius and a lot of newer cars as well. You can just simply walk up to the car and it'll unlock because your remote control there is able to have some sort of transaction with the car and identify you as the legitimate owner. So here, John Keyser, hardware engineer at Research, he has a Prius and we took some gear out a while back and he's holding the remote control. And what actually happens there is that the car is constantly broadcasting a low frequency signal, and this is picked up by a 3-axis LF pickup within the remote control. And when you get close enough, the remote control hears that signal, decodes it, and actually sends back an acknowledgement on the frequency that would be used if you would actually press the button itself. So that goes back over UHF. And so the idea was to use the X310 there, which has 2 channels, to both look at the low frequency side of it and the UHF side of it simultaneously in time, so you could see if there was some sort of time correlation going on and how the timing actually worked. So we have it hooked up, very, very high-tech LF pickup antenna there, just shoved in the door handle, and then just a vertical antenna there. So here, if you're looking borderline, you can see the frequency domain of the LF. It's more interesting in a time domain. This is actually a complete transaction. So first you have the Wakeup, which is what the remote is initially waiting for. Then the ID is sent by the car once the remote has identified itself. And then there's some sort of cryptographic challenge that the car then sends out once it sees the remote. For the frequency domain of the UHF, you can see that it's some sort of on or off keying there. And if you look at that in the time domain there, you can see first there's an ACK to the car. So the car's sending, hello, are you there, are you there? The remote control sends an ACK. Then the car sends some more information, there's another ACK, and then there's a response. That's the response to the cryptographic channel. And if you look at them together in borderline, then you can see time overlaid that the LF broadcast is very periodic, that's the blue horizontal line. And if you animate that, then that red blip there is something else. I think I was tuned off frequency here, so you can't, okay, you see that thicker purple line there? That's when the transaction happens, very, very quickly. So actually, that was in GNU area. There's a little borderline sync block there, so you can take in both channels from the user, then you can send them both to borderline and visualize them together. But in the newer instance, I thought, well, you know, the crypto there probably is good. Of course, anybody that says that needs to have other people go and vet that, because that's very dangerous to say. But this is the Wakeup and challenge. So the idea then was to see whether you can make an RF relay using GNU radio and the software-defined radio. So essentially separate the remote control from the car physically, but have the car still think the remote control is. So we've got a hammered-up converter turning the LF up for the B210 there, and then another B210 transmitting back to UHF. Inside there's an X310, and that LF signal from the car is going to be rebroadcast by that very high-tech LF portal there. The loopback is just going to be received to pick it up to make sure that it is working, and then that's the zoom in version, and then the UHF will be received by that B210, and then obviously back outside. So the idea is that this is physically separated, it's using GNU radio, and everything in between these 2 locations is being transferred over Wi-Fi over IP, with just a simple transport in between. So once we put the remote control down there into the LF coil, then what do you know? That is what is being picked up outside. It's VNC'd into the laptop outside. It's the Wakeup. And if you look, there are a couple of these, but I just want to, okay, so if I could draw your attention to this screen, this is the user, and the idea is that you only want to ship a small amount of samples over this Wi-Fi link, and you only want to send samples when there is actually RF activity. So you can just go complex to mag, and then you have some preset threshold, so anything above that threshold you want to ship, and then it just goes into this gate block. So when your threshold exceeds your preset level, it'll go to from 0 to 1, it'll open up the gate and then send samples through, and then it'll just ship it over the network. It's a pretty basic stuff there. And then this is inside, so it's actually receiving the LF there, and then it's waiting to send the UHF signal back outside, and then the LF just give that same thing. So there you can actually see that it's picking up the broadcast, and this is actually the peak hole of the UHF response that was sent back. So the remote control is actually hearing the car inside. That's a good first step. And then same deal with the UHF thing that's outside. You can see the use of outside is rebroadcasting that to the car. And so things were beginning to work. And I thought, well, I'm not going to bother analyzing this further. I'm just going to see what happens. And you can see the spectrum jumping on the right-hand side as the remote control is replying. It thinks it's, at least in the first phase of being next to the car. I'm really super excited, but I know in the back of my head, well, you know, hopefully, maybe slight chance. Of course it's still locked. Can anybody tell me why it would still be locked? What's wrong with this system, fundamentally? Exactly right, yes. So if you do in fact capture those two signals correctly together, then you can see that the LF is in blue, UHF is in red, and they happen in very quick succession of one another. So if you look at it in the time domain, you've got the LF, you've got the response, you've got another one in the ACK, and then the cryptographic challenge and response, and they all happen very, very quickly. And if you violate this timing, then naturally the state machines in the receiver are going to reset themselves, and then it's going to say, oh, it's a bad transaction. So they implemented at least this part of the security properly. Now, let's say you were going to get two X310s, and you were going to put RF on them, or they are already RF enabled, and then you connect them directly with some Ethernet cable. Sure, you've given up the wireless aspect of this, which is a bit of a pain. And this is a proof of concept. Maybe your latency between the devices streaming directly through might be low. But I guess that's future work for anybody that wants to venture that. So the final bit of this little deck is about multipaths, as I mentioned before. Can anybody guess what signal is actually being visualized here in board line? ATSC, who said that? Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And so this is what it looks like then, just in the frequency domain, and you can always tell ATSC by this pilot on the left-hand side. That's the sort of giveaway. So Tektronix has a really nice application note about ABSB that explains the modulation and so on. So I recommend you check that out. And they have some nice diagrams in there. But the point of this experiment was to have a look at how multipath can be visualized. So ABSB relies on these 8 voltage levels that get encoded from the digital bit stream that is set up by the encoder. And of course, for a receiver like a TV, say, to actually receive the signal, you have to have some known sequence in both the transmitter and the receiver, so the receiver knows to lock onto it. And every so often, amongst the data, you have these synchronization elements. And you have the major synchronization, which is the field syncs. And of interest is the 511 long symbol section that's used by the equalizer and the receiver. And this is kind of nice because it ties back to the origins of GNU radio in its attempt to decode the ATSC and get around the broadcast flag. But this is attacking it from a slightly different angle here. So the idea is that there's this long known sequence that's broadcast regularly in digital television technology. So this is what it actually looks like, the PN510 sequence starts to put it through the modulation. And this is a fixed sequence, and you can use this then to correlate against a signal that's being received in real time from the receiver. And to actually generate that sequence you just saw, very simple flow graph. We just put the pseudo noise sequence that's documented in the spec in this block, and then you put it into a vector source, put it into those 8 voltage levels that are defined by the spec, add the pilot here, multiply them, and then you filter off the left-hand side, so you get NTSC that way, sort of define it up. So what's interesting then is that once you correlate this against a received signal, you can see these very regular correlation peaks as you would expect from a legit NTSC signal. So if you then imagine we're looking at this front on over time, if you were to sort of change your perspective and look at it from the side, where you overlay all of these on top of one another, you detect a correlation peak and then you put more on them, you can see that you get a really nice high peak there, and just in all the samples around it, you get a much lower value. So that's what you want from a good correlation sequence. Now, if you then turn the axis again and then you look at it over time, which is the vertical there, as you look through your received capture file, this view locks onto the strongest correlation peak, and then just keeps locked onto that vertically over time. And then on the horizontal, it's just samples either side of that, of the output of the correlator. So if you consider it a normal transmission system, you've got your transmitter, and you expect to get your idealized direct path to your receiver that's without a reflection. But say you're dealing with multipart. Say you're dealing with the signal that's coming in from multiple directions, and you don't even get the direct path to the transmitter. So let's say you're in a house that's behind a hill, you've got a transmitter behind you, and then you've got hills in the distance that are reflecting that signal coming back. Then you might be in the South Bay, have this exact instance where you have a TV transmitter up in the Central Tower, and the signal is reflecting off hills down here, and then back up to you. Nice 3D view and dual, there's a hill here and a third one down there. So what you can do is you can run it again, and remember how I said it would lock onto the strongest correlation peak? Imagine now that you're holding your antenna against in the direction of one hill, and then you rotate it slowly over time to face the other hill. As you do that, you will first pick up the correlation peak from your more direct, stronger path, which is this one here. And then as you rotate it, it will decrease in intensity because your signal is being weakened. But if you have multiple paths to your signal, then you would expect that same signal to arrive slightly delayed in time. We know that there's another hill that's further away, so the flight time of the signal is going to be longer. And so we have this other correlation peak come up out of the noise on the right-hand side. So this is actually the same TV signal that's traversing different paths through the real world, and then we can actually see how they're offset in time and how many of them really come in. Actually, there seems to be a third weak one in there, and maybe another one in there. So it's actually kind of cool then to see and know that your RF signal is not only coming in directly from one way, but it's bouncing off all sorts of different things. And that's why equalization is so important. And Tom actually has some nice equalizer docs in his tutorials on the GNU website that I found very informative. So that was great to learn. And then just to finish this part, I decided to go for a drive and sort of reverse the problem. So record the signal of a TV station while driving, and I was thinking, well, maybe there's like a big mountain or a big building or something that might be reflecting the signal, and then I'll be changing the distance because I'm going to be driving toward that object. And so I was hoping to see some sort of diagonal line in this plot, and I think if you zoomed in, I haven't really verified this too much, but I think there is a little bit of an angle to some of those lines. I hope. What do you think? I saw a thumbs up. So I'm hoping there that as the distance is changing through that multi-path segment that I'm driving, that's reflected in that. So just like to do a quick shameless plug for Cyber Spectrum. You might be aware of it. It's a monthly software-defined radio meetup. everyone's welcome. We've been alternating between Edis Research HQ and Noise Bridge in the city of San Francisco, but there's going to be a very special event tomorrow night, and I have to say a big shout out to Virginia Tech and the Hume Center, Tim O'Shea and Bob McGuire for helping us secure this venue tomorrow night. If you want to come along, please do. Meetup.com/cyberspectrum, and we live stream them and record them if you're interested in the future attending virtually or physically. So that's that. Just in the final few minutes then, I'd like to switch back to my other laptop and do some live stuff. Okay. All right, so remember how I was talking about the video downlink for the drones? Can anybody recognize, this is actually recorded and looking at it in borderline frequency domain, can anybody recognize this sort of modulation scheme? Does it look familiar to anybody? I have given you a couple of clues.
NTSC. NTSC.
It is NTSC, that's completely correct. It's NTSC over FM. That's what these drones are transmitting down from their little vision modules. And so, if you think about it, that's actually spectrally incredibly inefficient. And of course they're concerned about interference because if somebody tramples on you, you don't see where you're going, you're going to crash. That's a disaster. And it's, I mean, you don't really see it anymore because everything's been replaced by digital schemes, but if you look at it in the frequency domain, it actually looks kind of deep there. So that's one particular frame. And that's in borderline. Now let's find GRC. So we did the Rickroll. So if I did this, then since we know we're talking about ATSC now, do it. Does anybody recognize this part of the the signal? Yeah, things like the front porch and the back porch. It's upside down. So I'm no NTSC expert, but let's see what we can do. So that's the FM demodulated version, and I was just a little bit lazy here. So what I did is I created these. This is actually creating taps for a filter. This is for the horizontal sync, and then I have taps for the vertical sync, like that. It's just some crazy thing. And then once you actually run the thing, you can see that the blue is the raw signal and the green is the output of those filters, and you can see that you get a nice peak, maximal peak when you hit the vertical sync, and same for the horizontal sync. So maybe another part of this would be then to take those, synchronize, and then start reading out the scan lines. It looks like there's no color burst in this particular signal, which is odd because I always thought there was color in these units, but the color burst should be here and it's not. And then doing color would be an additional challenge. But who uses analog nowadays? So I'd like to do another shout out to Max Park over there. He's been one of the guys instrumental in the Op25 project. It was a bit of fun at DEF CON this year because the goons at DEF CON actually use Op25 on their Motorola MX6 radios.
Calling my board in California.
That's my good friend Matt Robert, who got me into software-defined radio. He did a capture using his Motorola and sent it through. So I patched things up so it works with 3.7 now, so we can push it and get it all working again. But Max has done some really nice things in sort of having an integrated GUI, and you can use it to correlate against various sorts of comm systems and see what's actually used. So definitely check that out. It's a really cool little project. Just very quickly then to finish up, you may remember a little while back I was talking about ways that you can use GNU radio to do blind signal analysis. And I was looking at signals coming down from a satellite. So usually we think about terrestrial signals. You can also just get a satellite dish and point it up and get a nice LNA, hook it up to an SDR, and receive all sorts of interesting signals that people don't really look at. So this one was from a bird above Australia. And I found these narrowband signals, and it was an interesting sort of exploration and learning about software-defined radio and DSP tricks to actually undo this one. It turned out to be 9600 baud QPSK, and there was some interesting data in it. But you can do interesting things like figure out what the symbol rate is, figure out what the PSK modulation scheme is, do frequency correction on that. There's just one little sort of hacky thing I wanted to show you here. This is a nice output showing us the symbol rate within this particular stream. This flow graph doesn't really actually know a priori what the symbol rate of the stream is, so we're doing some trickery here. And it's a very simple cyclostationary analysis. So the relevant part here is that you take the signal and multiply it by the complex conjugate of the delayed signal. So here we're going in, we delay it by one sample, multiply the conjugate, complex to mag, take the FFT, and if you look at if you look at this and you average it, you can see there's a nice strong peak there at 9600 kilohertz, 9.6 kilohertz, which is indicative of 9600 baud. That's a pretty common rate. But how do we get that number sync out? Hopefully you'll see the humor in this, maybe the crazy humor in this. So instead of reading off there, we want a little bit of iterative flow graph to figure out what that number is. So instead, we take the output of the complex to mag, put it in a string to vector, manually take the FFT, turn it back into a string. And remember, when you take the FFT of a real stream, you get symmetry, so we ignore half of the spectrum. And then you can do that with keep M and N, and you can see one is half the other. Complex to mag again, vector to stream. And then you can use the argmax block to find the strongest bin. That's what we want to do. But the problem with this approach is that you get very strong amplitudes in DC and near DC, which we want to ignore, because otherwise we get a false result. We want to look for the bins that are further out. So you can get the vector source and create a vector of the FFT size, which has the first 10 values 0 and the rest of them is 1. So then you multiply that by your incoming vector source to null out those first 10 bins and keep the rest. And then you put it into argmax, and then put it into the number sync, you scale it appropriately, and then just get the baud rate given to you by GNU radio. So that's something that's been kind of handy that you can use maybe on something like this. But the first thing you might want to do with this is actually just receive the captured sample and then multiply the signal by a power of itself. So here, if you get the power, see there's nothing there. If you raise it to the power of 2, then do we get something? No, we want to look for strong peaks sticking out of the signal. If we go to 4, then we have these strong, see how we have these strong peaks sticking out? That's actually indicative that it's power 4, so it's order 4, so it's QPSK. And then you can do that FFT trick that I showed you with the cyclostationary analysis to read off the baud rate, and then you can use the really nice existing clock recovery blocks and costless loop and what have you to try and recover your constellation and your raw data bits. So in the last minute, I just wanted to show you another little trick that we do. This was samples recorded off an over-the-horizon HF radar. You'll hear it fire up in a second. I guess one thing I want to emphasize here is that don't underestimate the power of actually sonifying or listening to part of your demodulated sample stream here. So in this case, I'm just basically doing single sideband out to the audio sync. And that can, in digital modes too, give you a hint as to what's going on. So below is the fast autocorrelation sync. This is looking for periodicity. So this is you're seeing the change in chirp rate. And as the chirp rate changes, you can see that the peak here is moving backward because the periodicity of the signal is becoming longer and longer. And then you can do that similar sort of trick that I showed you before, and it's actually reading out the chirp rate here on the number plot. So the strong peak here is now under 100. And then last but not least, this is something very recent from Inmarsat, very narrow-band signals that are sending probably Nick Foster already. So, where's Nick? He was here. He's being shy. ACARS messages and other interesting aviation messages over Inmarsat. And all the same sort of techniques can be applied to recover the single stream. Here we're actually listening to the raw data coming down. This is being dumped to a file, and then you can take the file, do a raster plot, and see, if there is anything particularly interesting within that file. So this is actually the raster plot of that file, and you can't quite see it. It's mostly pseudo-noise, but at the very beginning you can see a very fixed and recurring pattern. That is actually the header or the sig field for that particular transmission. And that's just using the same sort of stuff, clock recovery, polyphase clock sync, with a root rate cosine filter. So yeah, there you go. A little bit of time. If you have questions, please come and find me afterwards. Thank you very much.